Malik's hands gripped the handle of the door, his fingers cold from the sweat that had begun to form. It wasn't just nerves. It was a familiar weight settling in his chest, the feeling he got every time he had to step into a medical office. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile, almost oppressive light across the room. His guide dog, King, sat by his side, his loyal eyes watching Malik closely, sensing his unease. "Just another checkup," Malik whispered to himself, though the words did little to ease the knot tightening in his stomach. His disability had been with him for years, and so had King, who helped him navigate the world, one step at a time. But the world was always watching, judging, and today, that judgment felt heavier than ever. The receptionist behind the counter barely glanced up from her screen as Malik entered, the sound of her typing the only acknowledgement of his presence. He moved past the desk, his crutches tapping against the floor with every step, the sharp sound amplifying the silence around him. He had been to this clinic before, but today felt different. His unease had shifted from a vague, lingering discomfort to something more specific, something that felt like it was waiting to happen. He reached the waiting area and settled into a chair, his heart racing. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each second dragging by. The other patients in the room seemed to barely notice him, their heads buried in magazines or their phones. King sat obediently by his side, his head resting on Malik's knee, offering silent comfort. "Malik Davis," the nurse's voice called out, snapping Malik from his thoughts. He stood quickly, pushing himself to his feet, trying to ignore the burning sensation of eyes that were undoubtedly on him. He was used to it, used to the stares, the whispers, the subtle but cutting judgments. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with a polite smile, led him down the sterile hallway to an examination room, where another set of harsh lights flickered above them. Malik felt his body tense as he entered the room. He had been here before, countless times, but today it was different. His senses were heightened, as though the very air around him was charged with something unseen. He sat down on the exam table, adjusting himself carefully, his crutches propped up beside him. Minutes passed. Each one felt like an eternity. Then the door opened. Dr. Thompson entered the room. The first thing Malik noticed was the doctor's posture, too stiff, too detached. The way Dr. Thompson's eyes barely met his, skimming over him as if Malik were merely a formality. It wasn't just the doctor's indifference that made Malik feel uneasy. It was the way he looked at King. Malik had seen that look before, the one that said, "You don't belong here." Dr. Thompson didn't bother to greet him. He didn't shake his hand. Instead, his gaze was fixed on King, who sat by Malik's side, alert and ready to assist. The doctor's lips curled slightly as he cleared his throat. "Does the dog really need to be here?" Dr. Thompson asked, his voice tinged with judgment. Malik felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. "He's my guide dog," Malik said quietly, trying to steady his voice, though the words felt like they were stuck in his throat. Dr. Thompson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the clipboard in his hands, flipping through pages as if Malik and King were nothing more than an inconvenience in his otherwise routine day. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, and Malik could feel the judgment radiating off the doctor. He had been in situations like this before, people who treated him as though his disability was something to be tolerated rather than accepted. "Well, let's get this over with," Dr. Thompson muttered, not bothering to mask the irritation in his voice. Malik shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the crutches beside him. King, sensing the tension, let out a low growl. "Doctor." Thompson paused for a moment, staring down at King, his gaze hardening. The doctor's lips twisted into something like a sneer. "I don't need a dog in here," he said abruptly, taking a step forward as if to push King out of the way. Before Malik could react, before he could even think, the doctor's hand came down harshly, attempting to shove King out of the way. King yelped, stumbling backward, and Malik's heart lurched. "No!" Malik shouted, his voice hoarse, his hand reaching out to protect his dog. But the damage was already done. The physical shove was only the beginning. The doctor's actions were cold, calculated, and filled with contempt. Malik's world suddenly tilted, his vision narrowing with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Dr. Thompson stepped back, his face blank as though nothing had happened, as though his actions had been justified. Malik's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at King, who was now trembling, his eyes wide with confusion. Malik wanted to scream. He wanted to lash out, to make the doctor feel the weight of what he had just done, but he didn't. Instead, he fought to control the rising tide of fury that threatened to spill over. His voice trembled as he spoke, low and steady. You just shoved my dog." Dr. Thompson scoffed, barely glancing at Malik. "It's just a dog. You should control it better." The words hit Malik like a slap. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat there, frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. The doctor's face was now a blur, his dismissive tone ringing in Malik's ears. Malik's hands trembled, but he didn't give in to the impulse to break down. He wasn't going to let this man, this racist, callous man, have that power over him. Not anymore. With King at his side, Malik stood up, forcing himself to steady his shaking legs. The rage inside him burned like fire, but he refused to let the doctor see it. Instead, he turned and looked Dr. Thompson square in the eye. "I'll be reporting this," Malik said, his voice low but filled with a quiet fury. "This is not just about me anymore." The doctor said nothing. He didn't have to. His indifference spoke louder than words. Malik and King walked out of the room, Malik's heart pounding in his chest. As the door clicked shut behind him, he couldn't help but feel that this was no longer just another appointment. This was the start of something bigger, something that would force people like Dr. Thompson to face the truth, no matter how much they tried to ignore it. Malik's hands shook as he left the doctor's office, his grip on King's leash tight, the tension in his body making each step feel heavier. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the noise of the world outside muffled by the deafening silence that had settled in his chest. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His mind replayed the incident over and over. Each frame burned into his memory. The doctor's shove, the way King had been sent sprawling across the floor, the cold indifference in Dr. Thompson's eyes. He didn't know where to go next. Part of him wanted to turn around and confront the doctor, to scream at him, to make him understand the cruelty of his actions. But Malik knew better. He knew that speaking up in that moment would only make him the problem. It would be his word against the doctor's, and no one would believe him. He had seen this happen too many times before. The world was quick to dismiss people like him, disabled, black, and in a medical setting the power dynamic was even more pronounced. He had been made to feel small, invisible, and this time it wasn't just his disability or race, it was his humanity that had been questioned. He could feel the weight of the stare as he made his way down the hall. His crutches tapped rhythmically against the tile floor, the sound amplified in the silent corridor. King walked beside him, keeping pace, his head held low, the confusion still evident in his eyes. The poor dog had just been doing his job, doing what he was trained to do, helping Malik navigate the world. And yet, he had been treated like an inconvenience, like a burden. It didn't make sense. "Why does this always happen?" Malik muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. He could hear his own thoughts crashing together, a cacophony of anger, frustration, and disbelief. He had been in this situation before, judged, dismissed, treated as less than human. But this was different. This time, the pain was more visceral, deeper, sharper. This wasn't just about him. It was about something far bigger. It was about a system that saw him and people like him as invisible, as unworthy of dignity, respect, or compassion. He reached the front door of the clinic, pausing for a moment before stepping out into the daylight. The air felt cool against his skin, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He had to do something. He couldn't just let this go. But what? Who would listen? Who would care? The world outside the clinic seemed unchanged. People walking by, cars honking in the distance, the hum of life continuing as if nothing had happened. Malik stood there for a moment, his breath shallow, his thoughts clouded. He had never felt so alone. Even with King by his side, even with the support of his family, there was an overwhelming sense of isolation that clung to him. The kind of isolation that came with being treated like you didn't matter. "Hey, are you okay?" Malik turned to see a woman standing beside him, her expression one of concern. She was around his age, her brown hair pulled back into a ponytail, wearing a casual jacket and jeans. She looked at him with kind eyes, her gaze soft but filled with curiosity. Yeah, Malik stammered, unsure of what to say. He felt exposed, vulnerable, the weight of the moment still too fresh for words. I'm fine. Just a rough appointment. The woman didn't seem convinced. She stepped a little closer, her gaze falling to King, who was still sitting quietly at Malik's side, sensing his tension. That didn't look like just a rough appointment, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Are you sure you're all right? Malik hesitated. Part of him wanted to tell her everything, the anger, the humiliation, the pain. But he stopped himself. He had never been good at sharing his emotions, especially not with strangers. Instead, he nodded. I'm fine. Really. The woman seemed to sense that he wasn't fine, but she didn't press further. Instead, she smiled softly, then turned to leave. But before she walked away, she looked over her shoulder at him. You don't have to carry this alone, she said quietly, and then disappeared into the crowd. Her words lingered in the air, echoing in Malik's mind. You don't have to carry this alone. He stood there for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and confusion. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone, but the fear that had settled in his chest didn't go away. The world had taught him time and time again that speaking up came with consequences. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the consequences of staying silent were even worse. He had to find a way to make people listen. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let the doctor's actions stand unchallenged. The next few days were a blur. Malik stayed quiet, his mind swirling with thoughts of what had happened, and of the woman's words. He tried to go on with his daily life, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the look on Dr. Thompson's face, the indifference, the dismissal, the way he had treated both him and King like they were nothing. Malik spoke to his family, trying to explain the incident, but their responses were what he expected, concerned but cautious. His mother especially didn't want him to stir up trouble. She feared for his safety, worried about the consequences of making waves in a system that had already shown its disdain for him. Malik understood her fear, but it didn't change the fact that something had to be done. He spent hours on his computer, researching his rights, reading about discrimination in healthcare, and learning about how others had fought back. He stumbled across stories of people who had been mistreated by medical professionals, only to face further victimization when they spoke up. The stories were heart-wrenching, but they also ignited a spark in Malik. If they could stand up and fight, so could he. Then came the moment when he made the decision. He would report Dr. Thompson. He would not be silent. But it wasn't just about Dr. Thompson anymore. It wasn't just about what had happened in that sterile examination room. It was about every moment he had been made to feel small. Every instance where he had been pushed aside, overlooked, or humiliated because of his disability, his race, or the combination of both. He would stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The day Malik went to the clinic to file his complaint was a turning point. The tension was palpable as he stood in the waiting room, facing the receptionist with the same indifferent expression she had given him when he first arrived. This time, he didn't shy away. He had a purpose now. I need to speak to someone about Dr. Thompson, Malik said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. I need to file a formal complaint about the way he treated me and my guide dog. The receptionist didn't respond at first. She looked him up and down, as if measuring him, deciding whether his complaint was worth her time. It took everything Malik had not to flinch under her gaze, to remind himself that he deserved to be treated with respect, just like everyone else. Finally, she nodded, still with that same blank expression, and directed him to a manager. As Malik walked through the clinic, he realized that he wasn't just walking toward a confrontation. He was walking toward a new chapter in his life, one that would be filled with challenges, yes, but also with the possibility of change. His heart pounded in his chest, but he was no longer afraid. He had a voice now, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. Malik stood in front of the clinic's reception desk, feeling like an outsider in a world he had never truly felt part of. He had fought with every ounce of his being to reach this point, to speak out against the doctor's treatment of him and King. But now, as the receptionist turned to make the call, the enormity of what he had done began to settle in. What if they didn't take him seriously? What if they dismissed his complaint, brushed it aside as an isolated incident? What if, in the end, he was the one who was punished for speaking up? The thoughts were like a weight in his chest, and despite the steady rhythm of his heart, it felt as though his breathing was growing more difficult with every passing second. The uncertainty of what would come next was overwhelming. "Mr. Davis," the receptionist finally said, breaking him from his thoughts. "Please follow me." She led him down another sterile hallway, the dull hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, almost deafening in the silence. Every step Malik took felt like it echoed in his mind, and with each footfall, his sense of dread grew. He wasn't sure what to expect when he spoke to the manager, but deep down, he feared that the system would fail him, just like it always had. They arrived at a small office, tucked away at the back of the clinic. The door opened with a soft click, and Malik followed the receptionist inside. A middle-aged woman sat at a desk, her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she flipped through a file. She looked up as they entered, her expression pleasant, but there was something distant about her gaze, like she was already preparing for the worst. "Please take a seat," she said, motioning toward the chair across from her. Malik sat down slowly, his mind racing. He could feel King's presence beside him, his loyal companion lying quietly at his feet. The weight of the room seemed to press down on them both, but Malik refused to let it show. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. "I understand you have a complaint about Dr. Thompson," the manager said, her voice neutral but her eyes never quite meeting Malik's. It felt like she was sizing him up, trying to determine how much she would have to invest in his case before deciding whether it was worth her time. Malik nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "Dr. Thompson shoved me during my appointment. He also pushed my guide dog, King. I want to file a formal complaint against him." The manager's eyes flickered for a moment, just a moment, before she looked down at the papers in front of her. Malik could feel the weight of her indifference. It was like she had already decided what to do with his complaint before he even spoke. The thought made his stomach turn. "I see," she said, her tone still measured, as if this were a routine matter. "I'll need to gather some information from you and ensure we have all the details. Please explain exactly what happened." Malik took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. The pain from the incident was still raw, but he knew he had to be clear. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his words. He had to make them understand. "I went in for a routine checkup, just like any other visit," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. "Dr. Thompson came in, looked at me, barely acknowledged my dog, and started his examination. When King started to growl at him because he got too close, Dr. Thompson shoved me. I almost fell off the exam table, and then, when King tried to help me steady myself, the doctor shoved him away." The manager didn't interrupt, but Malik could see her scribbling something down on a notepad. Her eyes were still focused on her paper, but her fingers hesitated when he mentioned King being shoved. "And what did Dr. Thompson say after that?" the manager asked, her voice soft, almost polite, but Malik could hear the underlying disinterest in her tone. "He didn't apologize," Malik replied, his voice tight. "He just brushed it off. He didn't even look at me. He acted like it didn't matter. And when I told him that it wasn't acceptable, he said, 'It's just a dog.' Like that was supposed to make it okay." The manager wrote something down again, her face still unreadable. For a moment, it felt like she wasn't really listening, like she was just going through the motions. "And what would you like to happen now?" she asked, the question almost mechanical, as if she was preparing herself for whatever Malik's answer would be. "I want him to be held accountable for what he did," Malik said, his voice firm despite the tightness in his chest. "I want people to understand that this kind of treatment, this kind of behavior, is not acceptable. I want Dr. Thompson to face consequences for his actions." The manager sat back in her chair, her expression still distant, but now there was a slight shift in her posture. It was like the weight of the words had finally landed, like Malik's words had pierced through her indifference. She didn't respond immediately. The silence in the room was suffocating, and Malik could feel his nerves beginning to fray. Was she going to dismiss him? Was this all going to be for nothing? Finally, she spoke. "I'll look into this," she said, her voice still neutral, but with a faint trace of something else. Maybe concern, maybe hesitation. "I'll conduct an internal review and get back to you. In the meantime, please know that we take these matters seriously." Malik nodded, though his gut told him it wasn't over. He knew that. But hearing her say the words, hearing her acknowledge his complaint, gave him a small sense of relief. At least he wasn't invisible in this moment. At least someone had listened. As Malik stood up to leave, the manager handed him a form to fill out. More bureaucracy, more waiting. She didn't offer him an apology or even an acknowledgement of what had happened, but at least she hadn't brushed him off entirely. Malik turned toward the door, his mind still racing, his heart still heavy with the weight of the encounter. King stood up beside him, sensing his anxiety, and walked quietly at his side. They had taken the first step in what would be a long road, but as they stepped outside into the cold air, Malik couldn't help but wonder, would this small victory be enough? Would the system that had so often failed him finally show up and do what was right? Or would it fold under the pressure of a few harsh words and the inertia of power? Malik didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. He had made his voice heard, and now it was time to make sure the world listened. Let's take a brief pause. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Your thoughts are incredibly important to us. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more powerful stories. Now, let's continue. The days following Malik's complaint about Dr. Thompson felt like an endless cycle of waiting, each moment stretching longer than the last. The initial rush of standing up for himself had given way to uncertainty. He had filed his complaint, spoken his truth, and yet there was an overwhelming sense that things wouldn't change, not for him. The voices in his head, the ones that had told him to stay quiet, to let things go, now whispered louder than ever, "You don't belong here. You won't be taken seriously." This is how it always goes. Malik had spent the last few days trying to push those thoughts out of his mind. He couldn't let them win. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. He had to keep pushing forward, but the emotional weight of it all had begun to wear on him. His body felt heavy with the toll of the constant stress and the pressure to fight back against a system that seemed designed to crush him. He hadn't told anyone about the worst part, the part that still haunted him when he closed his eyes at night. It wasn't just the physical shove from Dr. Thompson. It wasn't just King being thrown aside like he was nothing. It was the look in the doctor's eyes, the disdain, the contempt that had been there from the moment he stepped into the room. It was the casual way Dr. Thompson had dismissed his humanity, his worth, as if Malik were nothing more than a burden, a problem to be dealt with. Malik found himself alone a lot, his family concerned but unsure how to support him. His mother, though loving and protective, had voiced her worries more than once. She had seen the toll that speaking up had taken on him, and she was afraid it would break him. But Malik had made up his mind. This fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was for King. It was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or humiliated. He couldn't turn back. It was late in the afternoon when Malik received a call that would change everything. He had been sitting in his room, lost in thought, when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something inside him told him that this wasn't just another useless voicemail. He picked up the phone, his heart beating faster with anticipation. "Hello, Malik." The voice on the other end was calm, professional. It was a woman's voice, but there was a certain edge to it that suggested she was about to deliver some kind of news. "Yes, this is Malik." "Hi, Malik. My name is Sarah Hawkins, and I'm calling from the medical board. We've received your formal complaint about Dr. Thompson, and I wanted to let you know that we've begun the investigation process. We take allegations like this very seriously, and I wanted to speak with you directly to get more details about the incident." Malik's breath caught in his throat. This was it. the moment he had been waiting for. It was the moment when the system had a chance to prove that it would do the right thing. I appreciate you calling, Malik said, trying to steady his voice. I need to know that this won't just be brushed under the rug. Dr. Thompson shouldn't be allowed to treat people like that. Not anyone, but especially not me. Not my dog. I understand, Malik. Please know that we're investigating this thoroughly. Can you walk me through the events of that day again? I want to make sure we have everything we need to move forward. Malik recounted the details of the incident as best as he could. His voice wavered slightly when he spoke about King, about how the dog had been pushed aside, as if he wasn't worth the space he occupied. He told her about the push, about the doctor's dismissive attitude, and how the man had acted as if Malik's life and well-being didn't matter. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, he thought the call had ended. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Malik, Sarah said quietly. This should never have happened, and I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to hold Dr. Thompson accountable. We'll keep you updated on the progress. Her words were comforting, but Malik could still hear the skepticism in his mind, the doubt that had followed him for as long as he could remember. He had seen people with less to fight for get crushed by systems that didn't care, systems that worked against them at every turn. He didn't want to let his guard down, didn't want to assume that things would be different this time. But deep down, he could feel something stirring. Hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. He knew he couldn't stop now. Thank you, Malik said softly, his voice steadier than it had been in days. I appreciate you taking this seriously. We do, Malik. We'll be in touch soon. Take care of yourself. The call ended, and Malik sat there for a moment, the weight of what he had just heard settling in. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was alone. He had made the right choice. And now, the battle was no longer just his. It was for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. The next few days were a blur. Malik tried to return to some semblance of normal life, but it wasn't easy. The investigation into Dr. Thompson was still in its early stages, and he knew that it could be months before anything happened. Meanwhile, he had to live with the aftermath of the incident. He had to face the world, knowing that some people would never see him as anything more than a disability, a stereotype. The worst part was that the whole thing felt so familiar. It wasn't just Dr. Thompson. It was the system, the way it had always been stacked against people like him. The feeling that nothing would ever change, that the world would always see him as less than. But every time Malik felt that familiar weight of hopelessness, he thought about the woman who had spoken to him at the clinic. You don't have to carry this alone. It was a simple statement, but it had made all the difference. Malik wasn't carrying this burden by himself. He had his family, King, and now he had the medical board. He had people listening. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that things could be different, that things would change. As the days wore on, Malik's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, setbacks, and challenges that would test him in ways he couldn't predict. But he also knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. He had made his voice heard, and now the world would have to listen. Malik wasn't invisible anymore. Malik didn't know what he had expected when he filed the complaint against Dr. Thompson. Maybe he had hoped for a quick resolution, for the doctor to be held accountable, and for things to go back to normal. But the reality was much more complicated. The days turned into weeks, and still no word from the medical board. The silence began to gnaw at him, every moment spent waiting adding to the tension that had already settled into his bones. It wasn't just the waiting. It was the feeling that, despite everything he had done, the system wasn't truly on his side. He had fought against his own doubts before, but now those doubts were growing louder. He had been on the receiving end of so many broken promises, so many empty gestures, that it was hard for him to believe things would be different this time. Every time he walked down the street, he felt the weight of the world on him. He was the black disabled teenager, the one who had been humiliated in front of others, who had stood up, only to be left wondering if it had made any difference at all. He tried to push those feelings away, but they lingered, following him throughout the day. It was as though the battle had only just begun, and already he was exhausted. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Malik's mother had asked him several times since the incident, her concern always evident, but so was her fear. She wanted him to stop pushing, to let the whole thing go, to avoid the confrontation that was sure to come. Her voice was full of worry, full of love. But Malik knew that if he listened to her, if he let this slide, it would be one more instance where he let people treat him like he didn't matter. He couldn't live like that. He couldn't keep quiet when it was clear that Dr. Thompson, and people like him, needed to be held accountable. "Mum," he had said to her one evening, his voice steady, "if I don't do this, then everything that happened to me, everything that happened to King, will just be meaningless. People like him will keep doing this. They'll keep treating us like we're nothing." Her eyes had softened then, and though she hadn't said anything, Malik could see the pride in her gaze. He knew she was scared for him. He knew she didn't want him to suffer any more pain than he already had. But even she couldn't deny that this was something Malik needed to do. Still, the weight of his actions never left him. He felt it every time he left the house, every time he saw someone glance at him with pity in their eyes, every time he thought about the world that had made him feel less than, had made him feel broken, and every time he thought about what had happened in that exam room, the anger surged again. Anger at Dr. Thompson, yes, but anger at the entire system that had allowed this kind of treatment to go unchecked for so long. Then, one afternoon, Malik's phone rang. He picked it up, recognizing the number instantly. It was Sarah Hawkins from the medical board. "Malik," she said, her voice warm but serious, "I wanted to let you know that we've made progress with the investigation. We've interviewed the staff at the clinic, and we've gathered several statements from other patients who've reported similar issues with Dr. Thompson's behavior. We're moving forward with the formal review, and the medical board will be taking action." Malik's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected things to move so quickly. There was still so much that could go wrong. But hearing those words felt like the first real acknowledgement of what he had endured. He wasn't alone in this fight. "What happens next?" Malik asked, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to remain composed. "We're going to conduct a formal hearing, and Dr. Thompson will be required to answer for his actions. We'll be reviewing his history with patients, and if we find that his behavior is consistent with what you've reported, then there will be consequences." Malik closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He had known it wouldn't be easy. He had known that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. But hearing that the board was finally taking real action made him feel like he had a chance. For the first time in a long time, the anger that had consumed him began to shift into something else. Something more focused, more purposeful. "Thank you," Malik said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "We'll keep you updated as things move forward." "And Malik," Sarah added, her tone softer now, "you did the right thing. I know it's hard, but you've made a difference." Malik didn't know how to respond. The words didn't feel like enough, but they were the first validation he had gotten since the incident. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just a victim. He was fighting back. And for once, the system was willing to listen. Over the next few days, the news about Dr. Thompson spread. The clinic faced intense scrutiny, with multiple patients coming forward to share their experiences of being treated poorly or dismissed by the doctor. Malik watched as the story gained traction in the media, seeing the words discrimination and abuse of power used to describe the behavior he had suffered through. It was strange, surreal, to see his own story being shared by so many. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he couldn't deny the sense of empowerment that came with seeing his pain acknowledged by others. But with the increasing support came the increasing backlash. The racist comments online were unrelenting. People who hadn't walked a mile in Malik's shoes, people who couldn't begin to understand the complexity of the issues at hand, were quick to judge. "You're just looking for attention," they said. "Why do you always have to make everything about race?" Malik read those comments, but he didn't let them consume him. He knew the truth. He knew what had happened, and no one, no matter how loud they yelled, could take that from him. He saw the worst of the world through those comments, but he also saw the best. Messages of support flooded in from all over, people who shared their own stories, who spoke up about the injustices they had faced, who let Malik know that they were standing with him. It was overwhelming, but it was also exactly what Malik needed. It was the reminder that he wasn't alone in this. The day of Dr. Thompson's hearing arrived. Malik walked into the room with a sense of purpose that surprised even him. His heart was pounding, but his resolve had never been clearer. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. As the hearing began, Malik spoke. He spoke with the pain of someone who had been ignored, but also with the strength of someone who had learned the power of his own voice. And as the medical board listened, he realized that for once, the world was finally starting to hear him. Malik's phone buzzed again. Another message. It was hard to keep up with them all. Texts, social media, emails, each one offering congratulations, encouragement, and thanks. Some were from people he had never met, others from those who had been in his life for years. There was one common thread in all of them: gratitude. Malik had ignited something bigger than himself, and he could feel it. The change was slow, but it was coming. The decision to suspend Dr. Thompson had sent ripples throughout the medical community, sparking conversations in clinics, hospitals, and online spaces. People were starting to talk about how patients, especially those from marginalized communities, were treated. How those who were disabled, who were black, who were different in any way, had been subjected to the kind of treatment that Malik had suffered. His case had forced people to reckon with their own biases, with the reality of a system that often overlooked its most vulnerable members. But with that recognition came backlash. Not everyone was happy with the decision. There were those who believed Malik was making a mountain out of a molehill, that the doctor's actions had been unintentional, that people were too quick to judge. They didn't understand. Malik knew they never would. The weight of being black and disabled in a world that wasn't designed for you was something they could never experience. But it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't fighting for them. He was fighting for people like him. Malik had expected the criticism. He knew it would come, but it still stung. The online comments were filled with venom, the kind of hate that he had seen too many times before. "You're just looking for attention," one person wrote. "This is all just a misunderstanding." Another said, "You're making the world worse by accusing this doctor. He's just trying to do his job." Malik read through the comments, letting the hurt wash over him, but only for a moment. He couldn't afford to let it drag him down. He had a mission now, a mission that was bigger than he was. The more hate he received, the more determined he became to push forward. He would keep going because he knew that change wasn't just about one person's victory. It was about everyone who had ever been ignored, mistreated, or made to feel less than. The worst comments, the ones that hurt the most, came from people who refused to see the problem. "It's just a dog," one person said. "Why make such a big deal about an animal?" Malik had heard those kinds of dismissals all his life. People didn't understand King. People didn't understand what it was like to be a team, to rely on something, someone, to guide you through a world that was built to make you stumble. To have King, who had been by his side for years, treated with contempt like that. It wasn't just an attack on Malik. It was an attack on everything he and King had built together. And it wasn't just about the dog. It was about the assumption that his pain didn't matter, that his suffering wasn't worth acknowledging. But then there were the messages that made it all worth it. People who had suffered the same fate as Malik. People who had been dismissed, ignored, or abused by medical professionals. They reached out to thank him for speaking up, for making their voices heard when they felt like no one would listen. They shared their own stories with him. Stories of mistreatment, discrimination, and fear. And Malik realized something. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been fighting alone. There were people everywhere who were just like him, who had been silenced for too long. And Malik was their voice. He had become the voice of everyone who had ever felt small, unnoticed, like they didn't matter. It was humbling, and at the same time, it was empowering. The messages came in waves, each one lifting him higher. He realized then that this wasn't just his fight, it was a collective one. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every disabled person, every black person, every person who had been treated as though they were invisible. He was fighting for the future so that things like this wouldn't keep happening, so that no one else would have to go through what he had gone through. As Malik's story spread, he started to see the ripple effect. His social media followers grew, and soon, people from around the country were reaching out to him, sharing their stories and offering support. They had watched him stand up and fight for what was right, and it gave them the courage to do the same. They weren't afraid to speak out anymore. They weren't afraid to demand the respect and dignity they deserved. And that was when Malik realized that this wasn't just about getting justice for himself or King. It was about starting a movement for justice, for equality, for the acknowledgement of every person's worth. But not all the feedback was positive. A few weeks after the news of Dr. Thompson's suspension broke, Malik found himself facing even more threats. He had known they would come, but that didn't make them any easier to deal with. Some people lashed out at him directly, sending him messages that ranged from nasty insults to explicit threats. Others simply accused him of being a troublemaker, saying he was making everything about race or trying to ruin a good doctor's career. One person even went so far as to claim that he should be grateful for the care he received, as if it were a favor, as if the doctor's actions were somehow justified because of Malik's disability. Every comment, every message stung, but Malik didn't back down. He couldn't afford to. The hate was loud, but the love and support were louder, and the more people spoke up, the more people rallied around him, the more determined he became to keep fighting. He wasn't going to let hate drown out the voices of those who needed to be heard. With the investigation still ongoing, Malik found himself facing new challenges. He had become a public figure, someone people could either support or tear down. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined, but he wasn't backing down. He had started something, and he wasn't going to let it die just because a few people couldn't handle the truth. This wasn't just about Dr. Thompson anymore. It was about a system that needed to change. It was about a world that needed to recognize the inherent dignity of every person, no matter their race, their disability, or their background. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation continued, and Malik's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was no longer afraid. He had a voice, and that voice had power. He was ready for whatever came next. The day Malik had been waiting for finally arrived. After weeks of anticipation, the medical board's final decision was about to be revealed. He stood in front of his mirror, trying to steady his nerves, his reflections staring back at him with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. He had fought hard for this moment. It hadn't been easy. There had been doubts, setbacks, and painful reminders that the world wasn't always kind to people like him. But he had kept going, one step at a time, for himself, for King, for everyone who had ever felt invisible. Malik's phone buzzed on the dresser, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah Hawkins at the medical board. "Malik, the decision has been made. Dr. Thompson's medical license has been revoked. The board has found his actions unacceptable and has permanently removed him from the list of licensed practitioners." Malik's heart stopped for a moment as he read the words. It was over. The man who had humiliated him, who had treated King like he was nothing, would never practice medicine again. It wasn't just a suspension. It wasn't just a temporary ban. It was permanent. Dr. Thompson's career had been destroyed by the very system he had once used to exert power over others. A wave of relief washed over Malik, but it was soon followed by something else, an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. It had been a long, hard fight, and it felt like it had drained him in ways he hadn't expected. But now, standing on the other side of it, Malik knew that every moment of fear, every moment of doubt, had been worth it. He had done what he set out to do. And now, it was time to look ahead. As the news spread, Malik's story became a symbol of resilience. The media covered the decision, highlighting how the case had sparked conversations about race, disability, and the treatment of marginalized communities in healthcare. People from all over the world reached out to Malik, thanking him for showing them that they had the power to stand up, to speak out, and to demand the respect they deserved. Malik's journey didn't end with Dr. Thompson's removal. The aftermath of the case was just the beginning. It was the start of something much bigger, a movement. People were finally beginning to talk about the issues that had been swept under the rug for so long: healthcare, education, the justice system. These systems weren't designed to help everyone. They were designed to protect those in power, to silence the voices of the most vulnerable. But Malik had shown that those systems could be challenged, they could be changed, and more importantly, people like him, people who had been pushed to the edges of society, had the right to demand change. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future. As the weeks went by, Malik started speaking at local events, sharing his story, and using his platform to raise awareness about discrimination in healthcare and beyond. He became an advocate, a voice for those who didn't feel like they had one. He worked with organizations that fought for disability rights, racial equality, and justice. He traveled to conferences, spoke on panels, and connected with others who were passionate about making a difference. One of the most surprising things that came out of Malik's fight was the support he found in unexpected places. People who had once been silent, people who had been afraid to speak out, now came to him for advice, for encouragement. The ripple effect of his actions was felt everywhere. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out to him, telling him how his courage had inspired them to confront the injustices they had faced in their own lives. He wasn't alone. They weren't alone, and together they were stronger than they had ever been before. Malik's relationship with King deepened during this time. King wasn't just a dog, he was more than that. He was Malik's partner, his protector, and his constant companion in this journey. The bond they shared was unbreakable. It was a reminder that they had come a long way from that day in the clinic when Dr. Thompson had tried to make them feel small. They had survived. They had fought back. And now, they were part of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. One evening, as Malik and King sat together on the couch, Malik thought back on everything that had happened. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all still there, but it had changed him. He had learned something important. Standing up for what's right wasn't easy. It wasn't about winning every battle. It was about fighting for what mattered, even when the odds were stacked against you. It was about refusing to be invisible, refusing to be silenced, even when the world told you to stay quiet. He looked down at King, who lay beside him, his head resting on Malik's lap. King's eyes met his, full of loyalty and understanding, as if the dog knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Together, they had made it through the hardest part. But now, they were part of something that could change the world. Malik smiled softly and scratched King behind the ears. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "We really did it." And though there was still so much work to be done, so many battles left to fight, Malik knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Malik Davis was ready to lead the charge. As we reach the end of Malik's journey, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think about this story? Have you ever experienced anything similar in your life? We deeply value your input, and your voice is incredibly important to us. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Your support means a lot, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Have a great day, and please feel free to share your thoughts. If you're still with us, leave a comment with the phrase, "I stand with Malik," so we know you've listened to the end. Thank you for being part of this journey.